Monica Reynolds never imagined that today would turn into a nightmare. "You need to leave immediately." The officer's cold voice echoed in the silent courtroom. All eyes were on her, the only black woman in the trial, standing in the midst of a sea of power suits. She clenched the file in her hands, the undeniable evidence of the discrimination she had endured. But instead of being heard, she was forced out like a troublemaker. Is this how justice works? The judge's gavel slammed down, the final blow to her last chance. "Bailiff, take her out." Sergeant Brandon Calloway stepped forward, his face a mask of cold indifference. Monica could see it clearly. To him, she was just another task to complete. But before Calloway could touch her, the courtroom doors suddenly swung open. A clerk rushed in, out of breath, clutching a piece of paper. "Your Honor, there's an urgent call from the White House." The room seemed to freeze. A call from the highest office in the land to intervene in her case? Who was behind this, and what was about to happen? Monica held her breath, knowing that from this moment on, everything would change forever. But what lies ahead for her? Justice, or a storm bigger than she could ever imagine? Can you guess what happens next? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next shocking twist. Shady Grove Courthouse stood like a cold fortress in the heart of the city. Monica Reynolds walked through the large, dark wooden door, feeling the chill that radiated from the gray stone walls. The click of her high heels echoed steadily on the marble floor, blending with the soft murmur of hushed conversations, the rustle of papers, and the rhythmic clacking of keyboards from the clerk's desk. The stifling atmosphere of power and procedure surrounded her from the moment she stepped in. The hallway was long and narrow, with rows of hard wooden benches lining both sides where those waiting for their hearings sat in silence. Some nervously fidgeted with stacks of papers, others anxiously conversed with their lawyers. The scent of old paper mixed with the faint trace of cold coffee lingered in the air, giving the place the unmistakable smell of endless trials. Monica took a slow, deep breath, trying to shake off the tension creeping through every cell in her body. It seemed like every eye was on her. Some glanced briefly before turning away, while others stared unabashedly. A black woman in a sharp black suit, walking confidently through the corridors of power. This wasn't a sight everyone was accustomed to. She wasn't a criminal, nor an anonymous witness. She was the plaintiff, the one who dared to take on one of the largest corporations in the region. Whispers drifted through the room like a breeze. "Is that her?" a middle-aged man whispered to the woman next to him. Monica didn't need to turn around to feel the skeptical stares and the assumptions swirling around her. Were they thinking she was exploiting the legal system for personal gain? Or did they recognize the injustice she was facing? She didn't have time to worry about that. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was her one shot at proving the truth. For over a year, she had lived with the feeling of betrayal, being pushed to the margins, forced to leave the job she had dedicated a decade of her life to. Today, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all the others, those who had been oppressed, robbed of opportunities just because of the color of their skin. Monica had meticulously prepared every detail, every piece of evidence, every argument with her lawyer. But despite the thorough preparation, a part of her couldn't shake the worry. Did justice truly exist within these cold walls? Or was this just another game of power where the strong would once again smother the voices of the weak? She stopped in front of courtroom 3B. The wooden door was firmly shut, and inside, Judge Beatrice Whitmore was ready. She knew the judge well, a sharp woman, notorious for being unpredictable, sometimes ruthless in her rulings. Monica wasn't expecting sympathy. She only hoped to be heard. She raised her hand and gently pushed the door open. In that moment, no matter how much she had prepared, her heart raced unnaturally fast. Just a few more steps, and she would enter the place that would decide her fate, the place where a single word, a single ruling, could change everything. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere grew even colder and heavier. Monica scanned the room where the most powerful people of the day were about to decide her fate. At the highest position, behind a carefully polished dark wood desk, Judge Beatrice Whitmore sat with an impassive expression. The middle-aged woman, with her platinum hair tightly coiffed and her thin glasses perched precisely on the bridge of her nose, had eyes sharp as blades. Whitmore was not someone easily swayed, known for her stern, impatient demeanor. She was also notorious for her bias toward large corporations. To her, plaintiffs like Monica were nothing more than troublemakers trying to exploit the legal system for financial gain, a weak pawn facing a massive force. On the opposite side, Silvermark's legal team sat in formation like predators accustomed to hunting. Expensive suits, sparkling watches, every movement calculated with precision. John Sterling, the lead attorney for Silvermark, leaned back in his chair, a smug smile curling his lips. He had handled dozens of lawsuits like this and almost always emerged victorious. To him, this wasn't a battle. It was just a simple formality, a game whose outcome had already been decided. Monica could see the confident, arrogant glances coming from the corporate legal team. They weren't afraid of her. They didn't view her as a threat. And that was exactly what made her more determined. Near the door, Sergeant Brandon Calloway stood rigidly, his eyes scanning everyone in the room. The tall, broad-shouldered police officer with the chiseled face and cold gray eyes glanced over Monica as if she had already lost the moment she walked in. To him, she was just like all the other plaintiffs, those who got thrown out of court for causing a disturbance, those who couldn't accept defeat. Calloway didn't care about who was right or wrong. His only job was to maintain order, ensuring that no one disrupted the proceedings. If Monica caused even the slightest commotion, he would be the first to throw her out without a second thought. Monica took a deep breath, gripping the file tightly in her hands. She could feel the overwhelming power imbalance in the room. Everyone present believed she would fail. They were too used to seeing lawsuits like hers get crushed after a few hearings. But they didn't know that Monica was prepared for a long battle. They didn't know that today, she wasn't here to lose. The gavel of Judge Whitmore rang out, signaling the official start of the trial. The room was so silent that Monica could hear her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, placing her hand on the stack of documents in front of her, feeling the cold paper under her fingertips. This was the moment she had been waiting for all year, a moment where she could speak for herself and for those who had endured the same fate. Her lawyer, Daniel Carter, stood up and stepped forward with calm determination. "Your Honor," he began, "my client, Ms. Monica Reynolds, worked at Silvermark Corporation for over 10 years. She was one of the most outstanding employees, highly praised by her superiors, until a new manager took over her department. Within just 6 months of his tenure, Ms. Reynolds was demoted, denied promotion opportunities, and eventually terminated without just cause. But we have evidence, internal emails, performance reviews, and witness testimonies that show this decision was not based on her abilities, but on the color of her skin." The courtroom fell silent for a few seconds. Monica clenched her fists, feeling the eyes of the people around her scrutinizing her. But soon after, a soft, dismissive chuckle echoed from the other side. John Sterling, the lead attorney for Silvermark, stood up, adjusting the collar of his suit with an air of superiority. "Your Honor," he said slowly, as if explaining something obvious, "we all know cases like this. A disgruntled former employee trying to extract money from her former employer by concocting a dramatic discrimination story. Yes, Ms. Reynolds was terminated, but it was because her performance declined, not for any other reason. We have documents to prove that." He paused for a moment, casting a mocking glance at Monica before turning to Judge Whitmore. "Furthermore, if the emails presented by the plaintiff are truly of any value, why were they never mentioned in previous internal proceedings? I fear we are wasting time on a well-scripted drama." Monica gritted her teeth. She had prepared herself for such degrading remarks, but hearing them echoed in a room full of power left her seething with anger. She turned her gaze toward Judge Whitmore, hoping for a fair reaction. But the judge simply waved her hand, signaling for the argument to be cut short. "Ms. Reynolds," Whitmore said, her voice icy and impatient, "we do not have time for personal, emotional stories. If you have valid evidence, present it immediately." A chill ran down Monica's spine. She knew Judge Whitmore had no sympathy for plaintiffs like her, but the judge's indifference was even more blatant than she had imagined. She glanced at her lawyer, receiving a reassuring nod from him. There was still a long way to go, but she couldn't back down now. Monica took a deep breath, gripping the stack of documents tightly. Her hands, every finger, seemed to feel the coldness of the paper, as though it reflected the chill of the entire room. She couldn't let herself falter. She couldn't let fear and helplessness take over. She had prepared for this moment for a whole year, and now this was her one chance to bring the truth to light, to prove that what had happened to her was not just an isolated incident, but part of a long-standing system of discrimination that had existed for far too long in large organizations. Monica stood tall, her gaze cutting through the thick atmosphere of the courtroom, locking with Judge Whitmore's. Every eye in the room seemed to focus on her, and she could feel each glance, each judgmental stare. But she couldn't back down. She spoke clearly. "Your Honor, I have additional crucial evidence to present. These emails not only prove that I was unjustly terminated, but also show a systematic pattern of eliminating employees of color at Silvermark. If the court permits, I can." "Enough." Judge Whitmore's voice suddenly rang out, cutting Monica off like a slap to the face. The judge furrowed her brow, her eyes full of irritation, as though Monica's presence in the courtroom was a nuisance. "I don't want to hear any more excuses, Ms. Reynolds. You've had your chance to present, and your lawyer has done his part well. We cannot waste time on arguments that hold no value." No value. Monica felt as though everything inside her was exploding. Every word from Whitmore felt like a knife, deepening the insult and humiliation. This was not the first time she had been cut off, but the harshness and bluntness of Whitmore's interruption made her feel as if she was never truly given a fair chance. She glanced over at her opponents. John Sterling, the lead attorney for Silvermark, still wore that smug, satisfied grin. He knew the trial had been rigged in his favor. Monica could feel the gazes of everyone in the room. They were looking at her as a failure, someone with no right to speak. Monica couldn't accept that. She couldn't let them steal this opportunity from her. She clenched her fists, feeling the tension rise, the determination surging within her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling but controlled, "these emails." "I said enough." Whitmore slammed the gavel down forcefully, sending a loud crack reverberating through the room, leaving no room for debate. "If you continue to disrupt the proceedings, I will have no choice but to have you removed by the police." The gavel strike echoed like a final verdict. The room fell into a dead silence. Monica could hear the heavy sound of her own breath, her heart thudding in her chest. She knew that one small mistake could see her dismissed right then and there. She couldn't react, couldn't fight back, because just one wrong move would make her lose everything. But in that very moment, she also realized that if she didn't speak now, she might never get the chance again. This was her only shot to be heard. At that moment, Sergeant Brandon Calloway moved. He stepped forward from behind, his tall figure blocking part of Monica's view. His every step was heavy with pressure, like he was pulling her into an unavoidable fate. His stance wasn't threatening, but there was no mercy in it either. One hand rested on his belt, while the other subtly lifted the radio at his side. His eyes fixed on Monica like she was a ticking time bomb. "Judge, I'm ready." Calloway's words hung in the air like a final sentence. Monica felt like a cornered animal with no way out. She could feel the tension in the room, the quiet eyes watching her, waiting to see how she would be escorted out. She didn't want to leave, but she knew that resisting would only hurt herself. The entire room seemed to be waiting for a decision, and Monica knew one moment of weakness, and it would all be over. She took another deep breath, feeling every muscle in her body tense with the final resolve. This was not the end. She couldn't let them silence her so easily. But she also knew that something no one expected, was about to unfold. And maybe, just maybe, that would change everything. Monica stood motionless, her gaze fixed squarely on Judge Whitmore. She could hardly believe that justice could be so brazenly stifled. The weight of the moment settled over her like a suffocating cloak. If she left the courtroom now, if she allowed herself to be ushered out like a troublemaker, then all the years of struggle, the sacrifice, and the fight for something bigger than herself would have been in vain. She had come too far, endured too much, and now was not the time to back down. She didn't expect an immediate victory, but she couldn't allow them to dismiss her with a wave of their hand. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the silence so profound that it felt as if time had slowed. Monica stood tall, refusing to flinch, even though every pair of eyes in the room was trained on her. Her lawyer, Daniel Carter, leaned in as though to speak, but then stopped. His hesitation told her everything she needed to know. He understood that now wasn't the time to argue, to push back. He was waiting, just like her, for something that would break this moment open. Across from them, the Silvermark legal team sat poised, confident, and almost smug in their position. John Sterling, their lead attorney, crossed his arms tightly, a faint but satisfied smile playing at the corner of his lips. He was enjoying the show, knowing that everything had been set up to ensure that this trial ended in his favor. Monica could feel their eyes on her, filled with disdain, treating her like a minor inconvenience. But she refused to shrink away from their gaze. Sergeant Brandon Calloway stepped forward, his tall figure moving with an unsettling calm. He placed himself right next to Monica, his presence overwhelming and cold. There was no rush in his movements, but the message was clear. He wasn't asking. This was a command. "Ms. Reynolds, I need you to leave now." His voice, though steady, carried an undeniable finality. There was no hint of anger, no raised voice, just an unyielding authority that left no room for debate. Monica's pulse quickened, the pressure building in her chest. Her mind raced, but she remained outwardly composed. She could feel her heartbeat echoing in her ears as she looked up at Calloway, standing tall and unwavering. "I can't leave," she said, her voice steady but strong, reverberating through the room. "I have the right to present my evidence. The truth matters." Calloway didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another step forward, his hand sliding calmly but firmly around her wrist. The touch was cold, impersonal, and sent a chill up her spine. As his fingers wrapped around her arm, Monica flinched instinctively, but she stood her ground, her eyes flashing with determination. The room was still. A ripple of murmurs passed through the gallery. Some onlookers exchanged surprised glances, while others lowered their heads, avoiding her gaze. There was a palpable sense of injustice that filled the room, but no one dared speak up. As Calloway's hand tightened slightly, preparing to escort her out, a loud bang suddenly rang out, making everyone in the room jump. The courtroom door slammed open, hitting the wall with force, sending a jarring echo across the space. A young woman in a sharp gray suit rushed in, her face pale, her breath ragged. She was Ava Mitchell, the court clerk, and her sudden appearance broke the tension in the room like a thunderclap. "Your Honor," Ava gasped, her voice breathless but urgent. "There's an emergency call from the White House." The entire room froze. The effect was immediate and profound. A few gasps filled the air, while others exchanged looks of stunned disbelief. Even Judge Whitmore, who moments ago had been growing more impatient by the second, leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing, her demeanor shifting from irritation to curiosity. "What did you say?" Whitmore's voice was no longer the cold, cutting tone it had been moments earlier. Instead, there was a tremor in her voice, betraying an unusual vulnerability. Ava swallowed hard, pulling out a note and holding it up before the judge. "The Secretary of the Department of Justice is en route to make a call. They've requested that you not issue any judgment until after receiving this call." For what seemed like an eternity, time itself seemed to stop. Monica could feel her own breath catch, the weight of the situation dawning on her. Calloway's grip on her wrist loosened slightly, and she could sense the shift in the air as the courtroom collectively held its breath. The tension was electric, the energy palpable, as everyone in the room began to process what had just happened. The power dynamics had just shifted, the rules of the game were no longer the same. Monica looked up at Judge Whitmore, her eyes searching for any sign of what this meant for her case. For the first time in the entire trial, Whitmore's unshakable mask cracked. Her usual composure faltered, and she seemed to hesitate, a rare moment of uncertainty crossing her face. She was no longer the untouchable figure of authority she had been moments before. Across the courtroom, John Sterling blinked rapidly, his confident expression momentarily breaking. He turned to his colleagues, his whisper hurried and filled with urgency. The smug smiles that had once adorned the faces of Silvermark's legal team had turned to tight-lipped frowns. There was no longer certainty in their eyes. They too understood that something had shifted. Something far bigger than them had just entered the scene. Monica looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of those present. The atmosphere had changed completely. The air was now charged with an electric energy, as if a storm had just rolled in. Everyone in that room understood that what had been an ordinary trial just moments before had now become something else entirely. A force more powerful than any of them had anticipated had stepped into the fray. The game had changed. Monica's heart pounded in her chest, but she felt a strange sense of empowerment surge within her. This was it, the moment that could change everything. The force that had always seemed so far out of reach was now pulling her into its orbit, and for the first time, she believed that she might just have a chance. And she knew, deep in her bones, that this was the turning point of her life. The courtroom, already thick with tension, now seemed to plunge into an invisible void where even the sound of breathing grew heavy. Monica could feel every eye in the room shifting from stunned disbelief to confusion, and then to an intense curiosity. A call from the White House. Those 5 words hung in the air like an unspoken verdict, leaving everyone frozen, unwilling to move or speak. Ava Mitchell, still standing in the doorway, gripped the note in her hand as though it was the only lifeline keeping her from being swept away by the impending storm. Her eyes were wide with fear and uncertainty. She wasn't sure where to look, at the judge, at Monica, or at the imposing officer standing next to her. Her breath had yet to steady, but she knew with certainty that she had just dropped a bombshell into the room, a shift in the very foundation of the trial. Judge Beatrice Whitmore, once a pillar of unyielding authority, was now completely still. Her sharp eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to assess the gravity of the situation. A brief furrow appeared on her brow, and the usual hard edges of her face softened ever so slightly, just for a moment. Then, like a switch being flipped, she regained her usual imperious composure. But Monica didn't miss the hesitation, the crack in the judge's previously unshakable demeanor. Across the room, John Sterling, Silvermark's lead attorney, shifted slightly, as though he was about to react, only to quickly sit back down. A strange smile flickered across his face, but it couldn't mask the unease in his eyes. His fingers tightened involuntarily around the armrest of his chair, his attempt to control the simmering frustration within him. Until now, he had been completely certain that everything was going according to plan. Crushing Monica, extinguishing the lawsuit, and walking away with a smooth victory. But a call from the White House. This was unprecedented. He had never prepared for something like this. Sergeant Brandon Calloway still stood next to Monica. His hand, that had once firmly gripped her arm, now loosened slowly. He said nothing, but Monica could feel the tension in every muscle of his body. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but a call from the highest levels of government was something a regular police officer couldn't just ignore. His cold gray eyes flickered with a momentary hesitation, like he was silently questioning whether he had just made a grave mistake. Monica, however, remained still, her body as rigid as stone. But inside, her heart raced wildly. She could feel that something was changing. A hidden force had just entered this battle, and she hadn't even seen it coming. Who had called? What had caused the government to intervene in this lawsuit? She didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. She was no longer alone. Suddenly, Judge Whitmore stood up abruptly, her chair scraping noisily against the wooden floor. The sudden movement sent a ripple of alarm through the room. Every eye locked onto her, waiting for the next move. "We will recess for now." Her voice was different this time, no longer sharp, but laced with a tension that wasn't there before. "I require all parties to remain in the courthouse until I return." John Sterling quickly stood. "Your Honor, I believe we need more information about this call. Who at the White House is intervening in this case?" Whitmore whipped her gaze toward him, her eyes flashing with deadly precision. "Mr. Sterling, I do not need anyone reminding me how to conduct this courtroom." She glanced at Ava Mitchell, still visibly out of breath, before stepping down from the bench with swift, purposeful strides. As she reached the door, she paused and turned, her eyes toward Monica. For the first time, the look was no longer one of disdain, but of something far more calculating, more deliberate. The door to the courtroom slammed shut behind Judge Whitmore. The room was left in a state of suspended animation, where no one seemed sure of how to react. Monica remained rooted in place, feeling the heavy shift in the atmosphere. The battle she thought she was about to lose had completely changed in a single moment. But was this truly a turning point in her favor, or was there a deeper plot unfolding behind that closed door? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. The real storm was just beginning. The door to the courtroom slammed shut behind Judge Whitmore, leaving an unbearable tension hanging in the air. Monica remained motionless, her hands gripping the stack of documents as if they were the only thing anchoring her to reality in the midst of the storm that was rapidly approaching. A call from the White House. She still couldn't wrap her mind around what had just transpired. This wasn't just unexpected, it was unprecedented. Why would the government care about a labor lawsuit? Who was behind that call? Sergeant Brandon Calloway moved toward her, but this time, the hardness in his eyes had softened. Gone was the usual intimidating, arrogant presence. Instead, there was a trace of caution. "Ms. Reynolds, follow me." His voice lacked the sharp command it had before, but it was still firm enough to leave no room for argument. Monica nodded slowly and followed Calloway down the hallway. As the door clicked shut behind them, she felt a slight shift in the air. The space outside the courtroom felt a bit fresher, but that change in the environment did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside her. What was really going on? She looked around. The people in the hallway were speaking in hushed, frantic tones. She could feel their eyes on her, some curious, some doubtful, and others clearly fearful. The news about the call from the White House had spread faster than she had imagined. On the opposite side of the hallway, Judge Whitmore was standing with a court official and another police officer. She could see the judge's hand shaking slightly as she held the phone, a stark contrast to the composed and commanding figure that had presided over the courtroom moments before. She was no longer in control. Calloway led Monica to a separate waiting area, far from the courtroom. "Wait here," he said quickly, before turning and walking away. Monica, standing by the window of the small room, watched as Whitmore continued her conversation on the phone with an urgency she had never seen from her before. Only moments later, Whitmore pressed the phone to her ear, and though Monica couldn't hear the words, she could clearly see the judge's face pale, as if receiving bad news. For the first time, Beatrice Whitmore was no longer the one giving orders. Monica watched intently as Whitmore nodded, her lips pressed tightly together, eyes blinking rapidly, a clear sign of extreme tension. From time to time, Whitmore would glance nervously back toward the courtroom, as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Monica could feel the tension growing in her body, every fiber alert, a sense of urgency building within her. Who was on the other end of that call? A few minutes later, the call ended. Whitmore stood still for a moment, taking a breath before turning to Calloway. Her voice was low, sharp, but Monica could still hear her clearly. "The Department of Justice is monitoring this case. They want to ensure that the defendant is not unfairly treated. But that also means we cannot dismiss this lawsuit as easily as before." The Department of Justice. Monica squinted. So it wasn't just anyone in the government intervening. This wasn't a casual reminder, it was a warning. Whitmore lightly brushed her platinum hair, but her hand trembled slightly. "I will handle this situation, but we need to proceed with caution." Caution. Monica felt a shiver run down her spine. What did that mean? A call from the Department of Justice was enough to shake even a seasoned judge like Whitmore. But the biggest question remained. Why did the government care about her lawsuit? And more importantly, who were they siding with? Monica sat rigidly in the waiting room chair, her hands tightly clasped together as her mind raced in circles. The air felt thick, and each passing minute seemed to stretch endlessly before her. She was accustomed to injustice, to being pushed to the margins, but she had never imagined that a higher power was watching this case. She didn't know what that meant. Was it a sign of salvation, or just a bigger game being played where she was merely a pawn? The door to the waiting room suddenly swung open. Sergeant Brandon Calloway stepped in, his gray eyes no longer carrying the cold, impersonal gaze of a lawman. The way he looked at her now was different. It wasn't the look of someone who saw her as a troublemaker anymore. Monica raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to speak. "Ms. Reynolds," Calloway said, his voice low but with an unexpected hesitation. He paused for a second, as though choosing his words carefully. "The judge wants you to come back." Monica's eyes widened. "Come back?" she repeated, certain she must have misheard. "What do you mean?" Calloway folded his arms across his chest, tilting his head slightly as he studied her. "I'm not sure exactly, but it seems you are more important than I thought." His tone was contemplative, his eyes fixed on her, as though he were trying to unravel something deeper about the woman standing before him. Monica said nothing for a few seconds. She stared at him, trying to gauge what this meant. Only moments ago, He had been preparing to drag her out of the courtroom, treating her like a troublemaker. Now, he was personally summoned to bring her back. What had changed? I need to know why. Her voice was steady, unwavering. Calloway sighed, glancing down the hallway as if checking that no one was eavesdropping. All I know is that the judge no longer has control like she did before. The Department of Justice is involved, and it seems like they don't want you to be dismissed so easily. Monica felt a surge of unease spreading through her chest. Was this a good sign or a bad one? Had someone finally seen the injustice she had been facing and decided to intervene? Or was this just another play by the powerful? She stood up, smoothing down the hem of her blazer, her gaze hardening with determination. "Fine," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "Let's see what they want." Calloway nodded and led her out into the hallway. As they passed by rows of waiting chairs, Monica noticed the eyes that followed her, no longer filled with pity or mockery, but now tinged with curiosity and suspicion. News of the call from the White House had spread quickly throughout the courthouse, and everyone was eager to see what would happen next. But even Monica had no idea what awaited her as the courtroom doors swung open once again in front of her. As Monica stepped back into the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. What had once been a room filled with a stifling air of oppression and indifference was now marked by an eerie, tense silence. Only moments ago, she had been the woman dismissed without a thought, pushed aside like a mere inconvenience, her voice unheard. But now, as she entered, every eye was upon her. It was no longer the cold, dismissive stares of before. This time, there was an unsettling mix of curiosity and anxiety in their gaze. Judge Whitmore resumed her seat, her posture rigid. But unlike before, her eyes weren't just cold and calculating. They held something more. There was a cautious deliberation behind her gaze, a subtle shift that even Monica could sense. The judge, usually so composed, was visibly weighed down by the moment. Something had changed, and neither she nor Monica could ignore it. "Ms. Reynolds." Whitmore's voice broke the silence, but it was no longer the sharp, icy tone from before. It was less biting, though still commanding. "You mentioned you have important evidence to present. This is your opportunity." Monica felt her pulse quicken in her chest, the rush of adrenaline flooding her system. This was the moment she had waited for, the moment she could force the truth into the open, the moment she could tear down the veil of lies and expose what had been hidden for so long. With steady steps, Monica made her way toward the projector screen, her eyes locked on the task ahead. Daniel Carter, her attorney, gave her a reassuring nod before plugging the USB drive into the computer that was connected to the screen. The projector flickered to life. Seconds later, the words appeared on the large screen. From David Langston, Human Resources Director, to Michael Turner, Senior Vice President. Subject, Marketing Manager position. I've reviewed the candidate list for this position, but I think we need to find someone with a more appropriate image. She has the skills, but she doesn't align with our target audience. We need someone a little less colored. The room plunged into complete silence, the kind of silence that weighed heavily on every soul present. No one dared move or breathe too loudly. The air itself seemed to freeze as Monica's words hung in the room, crystal clear and undeniable. Monica could hear the sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the back. The whispers that followed, hushed but frantic, filled the space as people exchanged quick glances. The jury members, the observers, and even the court staff seemed to shift uncomfortably. Monica didn't have to look at them to know that their eyes were wide with shock and recognition. The truth, once hidden, was now laid bare before them. Judge Whitmore's eyes flickered over the email, her face briefly betraying her usual control. She leaned forward in her chair, her lips tightly pressed together as she reread the words on the screen. If she had been able to ignore the injustice before, she could no longer do so. The evidence was too stark to overlook. Across the room, John Sterling, Silvermark's attorney, stiffened in his chair. The smug, arrogant expression he had worn since the start of the trial had completely evaporated. His face turned pale, the once confident smirk replaced by a tense frown. His body language shifted, betraying the growing tension. He leaned toward his colleagues and whispered something, but there was no certainty in his actions. The ground was shifting beneath him, and he knew it. Monica's gaze remained fixed on them. She could feel the world turning in front of her eyes. The battle she had once thought was lost had suddenly gained new life. She took another step forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong. I worked at Silvermark for over 10 years, achieving the highest performance in my department. I wasn't fired for incompetence. I wasn't removed from my managerial position because of any lack of expertise. I was removed because of the color of my skin. A sharp gasp rippled through the room. The shock wave was palpable, the invisible force of Monica's words reverberating across every corner of the courtroom. The truth that had been suppressed for so long was now spoken loud and undeniable. It couldn't be ignored anymore. John Sterling finally stood up, his attempt at regaining control painfully obvious. He cleared his throat, straightened his jacket, and forced a smile, though it was thin and brittle. "Your Honor," he began, his voice strained, "I believe these emails don't show the full context. They can easily be misinterpreted." Monica didn't let him finish. She swiftly pulled up another email, this time one from Edward Langston, the CEO of Silvermark, responding to the earlier correspondence. From Edward Langston, CEO of Silvermark. To David Langston, HR Director. "I understand your point. Do what needs to be done, but keep it discreet. I don't want any legal issues arising from this." This time, no one could argue. John Sterling's jaw clenched tightly, and his face drained of color. He stood frozen, his eyes darting back and forth, unsure of how to proceed. There was no defense left, no way to hide the truth. Judge Whitmore slowly removed her glasses, placed them delicately on the desk, and rubbed her temples. The room knew what that meant. She was feeling the weight of the moment. Monica didn't need to look at the jury to know that the truth was clear. She could feel the change in the air, the shift in the dynamic. The tide had turned, but the real battle was only just beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. John Sterling slammed his hand on the table, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, his voice taut with tension but still attempting to maintain composure. "These emails. We need time to verify their source and check their authenticity before proceeding." Monica narrowed her eyes, a feeling of frustration rising in her chest. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. Sterling turned to Judge Whitmore, his eyes filled with desperate persuasion. "We request a delay in proceedings so we can thoroughly examine these documents. We cannot be expected to respond to evidence we haven't had time to review." He was stalling for time. Monica knew that immediately. He needed time to figure things out, to find a way to turn the tide, or even twist the truth. If he had enough time, he could fabricate a story, find a legal loophole to dismiss the emails, or maybe even convince witnesses to alter their testimonies. She couldn't let him get away with that. Monica stood up, stepping forward with a confidence she hadn't expected from herself. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "These emails were taken directly from Silvermark's internal system. They have timestamps, sender names, and full metadata that authenticate their origin. If the defendant truly needs to verify them, they can do so right now. There's no need to delay the trial." Sterling spun around, his eyes flashing with rage. He hadn't expected her to respond so quickly. And furthermore, Monica continued, cutting him off before he could speak. "Silvermark has full access to their own system. If they want to prove these emails are fake, they can do so within minutes. But if they're just stalling, that won't change the truth." A wave of tension swept through the courtroom. Several jury members nodded slightly, agreeing with Monica's argument. Judge Whitmore, who had been silently observing this back and forth, slowly leaned back in her chair. Her eyes sharpened with scrutiny, as if weighing who was telling the truth. Monica held her gaze steady, never blinking. She would not let Silvermark slip away this time. Whitmore slowly banged the gavel down. "The motion for a delay is denied," she declared. Sterling froze, his face tightening as he bit his lip, trying to contain his rage. Monica couldn't help but smile slightly. Silvermark was flailing, but this time they couldn't escape. News of the trial spread quickly, like wildfire after a single spark. At first, it was just short articles on local news sites, mentioning a discrimination lawsuit at Silvermark. But when the internal emails were leaked and became the central evidence in court, everything changed. Sensational headlines began to pop up on major news outlets. "Silvermark faces racism charges, shocking evidence in court." They wanted less color. How a major corporation silently removes employees of color. National TV stations quickly jumped on the story, digging into every detail of the case, from the lawyer's statements and Judge Whitmore's demeanor to Monica's reactions in the courtroom. It didn't take long for the online world to turn the lawsuit into a hot topic. Forums and discussion groups exploded with mixed opinions. Some people expressed outrage over Silvermark's treatment of its employees, while others questioned whether the case was financially motivated. What Monica didn't expect was the overwhelming wave of support forming behind her. Human rights organizations began to speak out, condemning the systemic discrimination and calling for a deeper investigation. Some even organized small marches outside Silvermark's headquarters, holding banners that read, "Justice for all," and "Opportunity shouldn't be defined by race." On television, legal experts entered the debate, analyzing the lawsuit from various angles. Some viewed it as a classic example of corporate injustice, while others speculated that the White House's involvement might have far-reaching political implications. Regardless of perspective, everyone had to admit that Silvermark was facing a real crisis. The company's stock began to dip slightly, with investors growing concerned, while Silvermark's executives were forced to hold an emergency meeting to discuss strategies for handling the growing backlash. Monica couldn't tear her eyes away from the news flashing across her phone screen. She had never imagined that her story would draw this much attention. Just a few days ago, she had been an overlooked former employee, a solitary plaintiff in a seemingly hopeless battle. But now, she was no longer alone. A movement was building behind her, and even though she didn't know where this fight would lead, she understood one thing. This was no longer just her fight. It was part of something much larger, something far more significant. In a luxurious conference room on the top floor of Silvermark's headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The glass walls reflected the flashing lights from the computers and phones, all constantly buzzing with updates. On the meeting table, a spread of documents lay scattered, most of them being the latest news articles about the nation-shaking trial. Edward Langston, the CEO of Silvermark, sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with rage. He gripped his phone tightly. A new message from the company's largest investor flashed on the screen. "We need an explanation immediately." The numbers on the stock screen were steadily declining, reflecting the growing loss of trust from shareholders. A crisis was erupting, and he knew if he didn't control it, Silvermark could be completely destroyed. 2 days ago, this was just a routine labor lawsuit, and now look at us. Langston slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising with fury. "We're surrounded by the media, our stock is plummeting, and don't forget the White House made a call to intervene in the trial. Who can tell me how we got to this point?" No one in the room dared speak immediately. David Langston, the HR director and Edward's younger brother, cleared his throat nervously before speaking up. "We could issue an official statement, emphasize that the company does not condone any form of discrimination. We can say that the emails were misinterpreted or..." "Misinterpreted?" Edward nearly growled. "Are you suggesting we tell the press that we need someone less colored was a misunderstanding? Do you hear yourself?" A deathly silence engulfed the room. John Sterling, Silvermark's lead attorney, quickly flipped through the papers in front of him, trying to regain control. "We can push back," he said, his tone colder, "by questioning the plaintiff's motives. Did Monica Reynolds receive funding from any organizations? Does she have political ties? If we can make the public believe that this is a coordinated campaign against Silvermark, the situation might turn around." Edward glared at him, his lips twitching as if weighing this suggestion. "You're talking about smearing her." Sterling shrugged. "It's not smearing if we actually find something that could weaken her case. We need a different story to shift the media's attention, something big enough to make them forget about those emails." A few members of the board nodded, as if they found this approach reasonable. But Edward was still not entirely convinced. He stood up, walking toward the window, staring down at the city below. "I don't care what we have to do," he said slowly, his voice cold as ice. "But we cannot let her win." A wave of invisible tension spread across the room. The battle was no longer confined to the courtroom. Silvermark had officially entered counterattack mode, and Monica Reynolds would no longer just face a large corporation. She would now confront a system of power determined to crush her. Monica sat upright at the plaintiff's table, her sharp eyes fixed firmly on Judge Whitmore. This was the turning point, the moment that she and her lawyer, Daniel Carter, had been preparing for over many months. They didn't just have evidence, they had the truth. Daniel stood, cleared his throat, and stepped forward into the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and commanding. "We have additional documents that show Silvermark didn't just discriminate against Ms. Reynolds, but has a long history of deliberately excluding employees of color from leadership positions." He turned to the large screen, where a series of new documents appeared. Secret personnel reviews in which the names of several employees of color were marked with negative comments without specific reasons. Doesn't fit the company image. Struggles to integrate with corporate culture. Not ready for a management role. But the most shocking revelation was an internal email, just leaked by an anonymous employee, where Silvermark CEO Edward Langston directly instructed HR to minimize promotion opportunities for employees of color. "We need to control Silvermark's image. We can't afford to have too many unsuitable people in senior positions." The courtroom erupted in astonishment. The jury gaped, some whispered frantically to one another, while Silvermark's lawyers stood completely frozen. Judge Beatrice Whitmore, who had previously maintained a cold, somewhat biased stance towards Silvermark, could no longer hide her shock. She bit her lip, her hand reaching up to her temple as if trying to regain control of the situation. But everything was too clear. She took a deep breath, then banged her gavel down. "The court announces that this case will continue with direct federal oversight. The Department of Justice will intervene." Those words were like a thunderclap for Silvermark. John Sterling stiffened, turning to his colleagues, whispering something in a panicked tone. CEO Edward Langston, who had always been confident that Silvermark would weather this storm, yanked his tie, his face flushed with fury. But Monica knew they had lost. For the first time since entering this battle, she felt that justice was on her side. Just 24 hours after the court's ruling, the news exploded across all media outlets. Silvermark under federal investigation. The company's internal emails had been leaked, leading to an outpouring of outrage on social media. Dozens of former Silvermark employees began speaking out, sharing their stories of discrimination while working at the company. Human rights organizations sent petitions demanding government intervention. But the biggest shock came the following morning. Silvermark's board of directors officially held an emergency meeting. A leaked photo surfaced. Edward Langston walking out of Silvermark's building, his face pale, tie loosened, holding a briefcase tightly. That same evening, Silvermark issued an official statement. CEO Edward Langston has officially resigned. The company will undergo a complete restructuring. Monica read the message on her phone, standing still for a moment. She hadn't imagined things would unfold this quickly. Less than a week ago, she had been dismissed from the courtroom as a loser. Now, the man who had ordered the destruction of her career had been forced to leave the company he once controlled. But Silvermark's nightmare didn't end there. A wave of class action lawsuits began flooding the courts. Former employees of Silvermark filed lawsuits demanding compensation for years of discriminatory practices. The Department of Justice announced it would expand the investigation, not just focusing on Monica's case, but also examining the entire company's personnel system. Silvermark had no way out. 2 days after Silvermark announced its restructuring, Monica sat in her usual cafe near her neighborhood, still unable to believe what had just happened. Her phone buzzed, and when she looked down, she saw an article with the headline, "Silvermark CEO resigns amid federal investigation." The world was reacting, but she still felt a sense of disbelief. Everything had changed so rapidly. She had fought for years to be heard, but now the world was listening. Suddenly, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "Ms. Reynolds." Monica turned around. Sergeant Brandon Calloway was standing there, no longer in his police uniform, but in a simple shirt with rolled-up sleeves. His eyes no longer held the arrogance or coldness they once did, but something else: regret, deep contemplation. Monica placed her coffee cup down on the table, crossing her arms. "What do you want?" Calloway sighed, pulling a chair out and sitting across from her. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said slowly, "but I want you to know that I've requested a transfer to the Community Relations Department. I want to do something meaningful instead of just standing by and watching things unfold." Monica was taken aback. She had thought this man would never change, but now she could see sincerity in his eyes. "So, After everything, you've realized you were wrong? She asked, her tone calm. Calloway smiled faintly, but it wasn't the self-satisfied smile from before. I realized that there are things bigger than rigid rules, bigger than the power of a judge or a corporation. And I realized that sometimes standing on the right side isn't easy, but it's always worth it. Monica stared at him for a few seconds, then nodded slightly. She didn't know if people could truly change, but she knew one thing. Every change, no matter how small, was a victory. And though her battle with Silvermark was over, she understood that justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey that would never stop. Months passed since the courtroom battle, and Monica sat on the balcony of her small apartment. The warm sunlight kissed her skin as she took a slow sip from her coffee. The world seemed calmer now, but the change within her was profound. She had found a peace that came not just from winning her case, but from something deeper, something that had ignited in her heart the moment she had dared to speak the truth. She had started a new chapter, consulting for victims of discrimination in the workplace. She worked with people who had been silenced, ignored, or oppressed, helping them find their voice again. To see someone stand tall, reclaim their dignity, and walk away from a toxic situation with their head held high, that, she realized, was the real victory. Not just for her, but for all those who had been denied their right to be heard. As she sat on the balcony, her thoughts wandered. She had been the one who fought in silence, in isolation, for so long. And now, with each person she helped, she was multiplying the impact of her own fight. She wasn't just a lone warrior anymore. She was part of something far bigger. The sudden vibration of her phone brought her back to the present. A message from Sergeant Calloway. She hesitated for a moment before reading it. I've started working in the Community Relations Department. Thank you for showing me the truth. If you ever need anything, I'm here to help. Monica smiled softly, the corners of her lips curving upward in a mix of surprise and gratitude. Who would have thought the same man who had once dismissed her in the courtroom, the same man who had been a symbol of the system that tried to crush her, had now become someone who understood, someone who was willing to do what he could to make things right. A small part of her wanted to believe that he had seen the light, that maybe his change would ripple through others, that perhaps his journey, too, had begun. She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of the moment settle in her chest. The fight she had fought wasn't just about one lawsuit. It was about the courage to confront injustice, no matter where it lurked. It was about challenging the status quo, even when it seemed impossible. It was about refusing to let the voices of the oppressed be silenced. Her journey had never been about one courtroom, one trial, or one corporation. It had been about awakening a larger consciousness, about challenging systems that were built to suppress. It had been about change, the kind of change that doesn't just shift an outcome, but transforms the fabric of how people see their own worth, how they see each other, and how they see themselves in the world. Monica looked up at the sky, the clouds drifting lazily by, the horizon filled with endless possibilities. She whispered softly, almost as though speaking to the universe itself, "If you believe in the truth, never stay silent. The world will try to push you down, to make you feel insignificant. But justice, real justice, will only come when we stand up. And when we do, it's never just for us. It's for everyone who has ever been told they don't matter." She smiled, feeling the weight of the journey behind her, but the promise of the future ahead. Her fight was not over. It had only just begun. Monica's battle was never just about a lawsuit. It was a testament to the power of courage and perseverance in a world where injustice still lurks everywhere. At work, in society, in decisions that seem trivial. Standing up is never easy, but if we don't speak up, who will speak for us? If Monica had accepted silence, she might have lived a quieter life, free from the risks of being crushed, but she would have carried the weight of regret with her forever. Each of us will face moments when we feel oppressed, overlooked, or pushed into the shadows. But always remember, you have the right to be respected, the right to demand fairness, and the right to fight for yourself and for others. No matter who you are, no matter where you stand, always remember that justice isn't something that happens on its own. It only comes when someone dares to stand up and demand it. Not everyone can confront a giant corporation like Monica did, but we can start with the smallest steps. Don't stay silent in the face of injustice. Don't ignore the biased words around you. And never think your voice doesn't matter. A small action today can create a big change tomorrow. Change starts with us, in the choices we make, in the courage to act, and in the belief that our voice matters. Just like Monica, we all have the power to shape our own destiny and, in doing so, inspire others to rise with us. It's not just about one person's victory. It's about creating a ripple that can transform the world around us. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Monica's story is not just about one woman's fight for justice. It's a reminder that every voice matters and every act of courage can spark real change. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about justice, don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button to stay connected with powerful stories that challenge the status quo. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Share this video with your friends, family, and anyone who needs to hear this message, because change begins when we spread awareness. Together, we can create a world where fairness and equality are not just ideals but realities. Thank you for being part of this movement. See you in the next story.